Stop. Stop. Stop it! Stop!
Coming in of a massive grid failure that has taken power out along the East Coast.
So far, we have no confirmation on what is causing this devastating outage, but rumors of a cyber attack are already being mentioned by authorities.
We now have reports that Texas has also lost its power in what appears to be a cascading domino effect. With as many as 100 million people now affected, authorities in the West are bracing themselves as they fear the blackout will continue to spread.
It has been an extraordinary last hour. The entire East Coast went out. Texas followed. Officials confirmed a cyber attack is the most likely cause behind this catastrophic failure. Forgive me, I'm being told right now that Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and San Francisco, they have all gone out as well. It's looking like a total power outage across the entire country.
A colossal and history-making blackout,
the likes of which we have never seen before.
Russian hacking to influence the American election has dominated the news, but we've also noticed a hacking attack that could be a future menace to America. Last weekend, parts of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, went dark. Holly Williams reports that Russia appears to have figured out how to crash a power grid with a click.
Nearly 250,000 people lost power in this small Ukrainian city when it was targeted by a suspected Russian attack last December. Vasyl Pemchuk is the Electric Control Centre manager and told us when hackers took over their computers, all his workers could do was film it with their cell phones. It was illogical and chaotic, he told us. It seemed like something in a Hollywood movie. The hackers sent emails with infected attachments to power company employees, stealing their login credentials and then taking control of the grid systems to cut the circuit breakers at nearly 60 substations.
What I'm talking about is a cyber attack against infrastructure, a cyber attack that could affect tens of millions of people for a period of months, if not longer.
Based on your reporting, it seems clear from your book that the national security officials believe that this is a matter of when and not if.
Exactly. In fact, that's a line that a man I came to know when I was embedded with the U.S. forces during the invasion of Iraq. He is now the commander of CENTCOM, four-star general Lloyd Austin, who said exactly that. It's not a question of if, it's only a question of when.
But hackers could launch a similar attack in the US.
We can't just look at the Ukraine attack and go, oh, we're safe against that attack. Even if we just lose a portion, right? If we have New York City or Washington, D.C. go down for a day, 2 days, a week, how does life look like at that point?
Rob Lee is a former cyber warfare operations officer in the US military and investigated the Ukraine attack. He told us some US electric utilities have weaker security than Ukraine. And the malicious software the hackers used has already been detected in the US.
It's very concerning that these same actors, using similar capabilities and tradecraft, are preparing and are getting access to these business networks and getting access to portions of the power grid.
But an attack in the US could leave people without electricity for days or even weeks, according to experts, because ironically, Scott, America's advanced automated grid would be much harder to fix.
There are some experts who say they're already in.
Oh, they are in.
They are in.
There is no question about it.
They're into our grid.
They are already in the grid. I was told that by the former chief scientist of NSA. He stated categorically the Russians are in, the Chinese are in. The Iranians may be on the verge of getting in. And then at the bottom of... I spoke to the two top officials at FEMA. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It would be their responsibility to deal with the consequences of an attack in the immediate aftermath. The deputy head of FEMA, who is a retired Coast Guard vice admiral, told me that in his opinion, in the event that a city like New York or Manhattan was hit, his response would be to evacuate. I said, evacuate 8 million people? Well, he said, you don't leave me with much of an option. If it happens, you've got to take care of the people, and the only way I can see you could do that would be to evacuate. The next day I spoke to his boss and said, what would you do? Would you evacuate? And he said, evacuate? You can't evacuate 8 million people. Where would you put them?
So we turned to Paul Stockton, a former Defense Department official whose duties included cybersecurity.
So what does the average family actually need to be doing? Do they need to be, as Ted Koppel has done, stocking up on water and freeze-dried food?
I think those are very important measures. Average citizens need to be able to take care of their own families and their own neighborhoods and their own communities, and not assume that Uncle Sam is somehow going to magically bring in the cavalry and rescue them.
Are the power companies today prepared to respond to a large-scale cyber attack on the grid?
Power companies today are strengthening their ability to respond to an attack and restore power more quickly.
Still, Stockton admits
their readiness is not where it needs to be, given that the adversary continues to strengthen the sophistication of the weapons that will be used against the United States.
Well, a serious warning from top national security experts. They say an electromagnetic pulse attack, also known as an EMP, could be devastating. It could easily damage the country's critical infrastructure, especially the electrical grid.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You have quite the resume of experience. You worked as an intelligence officer for the CIA. You focused specifically as well your career on this threat. When you look at what's facing our nation right now, why is this of such great concern to you?
Because it is the greatest threat that our nation and Western civilization faces. You know, it was deeply classified throughout most of the Cold War, and only after the EMP Commission reports declassified much of the information about EMP did it become publicly known. And so it is one of the least understood threats, and yet the greatest threat that we face. You know, because if a terrorist organization or North Korea or Iran detonated just a single nuclear weapon at high altitude over the United States, you know, it would destroy the electric grid and our critical infrastructures and put at risk the lives of up to 90% of the American people. You know, we all depend directly or indirectly. We all live directly or indirectly off of electricity. We're an electronic civilization. And it's also a threat from nature, you know, because there is such a thing as a geomagnetic superstorm. They've happened in the past in 1859 and 1921, and they're inevitable. It's going to happen again someday. There was a NASA report in last year that said that that we just barely missed by 3 days being hit by a geomagnetic superstorm back in 2012. And when that happens, it could take out electric grids and the critical infrastructures that support life.
The threat of a terror attack is one that needs to be taken seriously now. So says my next guest, former United States Ambassador and former Director of the CIA, James Woolsey. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. And the CIA. You know firsthand how many enemies we have out there. What do you think is the biggest threat to our grid?
They could launch a satellite with a simple nuclear weapon in it. Best if they launch it around the southern pole because we don't have any defenses and very little warning down there. And while it's in orbit, just detonate it. And this could be a very simple nuclear weapon, similar to what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It doesn't have to be sophisticated at all. Doesn't need any accuracy. You're not trying to hit anything on the ground. You're just detonating a nuclear weapon up 30 miles or so in space. That would take out the grid for probably a quarter to a third of the United States, and if you detonated it up at a couple of hundred miles, it would take out the grid for most of the United States.
And why don't we have the defenses in the southern part, and I talked about this in the open, in the southern part of our nation, so that a satellite could come in and could be detonated? I mean, it doesn't have to even be specific. Why are there no missile defenses down there?
I guess I would say, if I were being flippant, that we've turned over defending the country's electric grid to people with the overall focus of ostriches. Nobody really wants to do anything on this in the federal government except stick their heads in the sand.
And Ambassador, do you think that the power plants across the country have the protection that they need?
No, absolutely not. Nuclear power plants, particularly if hit by an electromagnetic pulse, would melt down before too long, and you'd have disasters emanating from the nuclear power plants as well as from a lot of other sources. If you take out, by taking down the grid, if you take out the electrical system, everything else goes down too. We have 18 critical infrastructures in the country, and 17 of them depend on electricity. So you lose your communication system, you lose transportation, you lose your bank teller system for getting money. Nothing works.
And you were the head of the CIA. Our enemies know all this, correct?
I'm afraid they do. The Russians have told us that they, back in the early 90s, told the North Koreans a great deal about how to use an electromagnetic pulse detonation. The Iranians and the North Koreans have both orbited satellites to the south, and the North Koreans have tested several simple nuclear weapons. Iranians haven't yet, but probably will before too many months go. So we have at least two very bad states tied very closely to terrorist groups and the rest that could be ideologically crazy enough to try something like this. And you know, you don't need a satellite. You can lift a nuclear weapon quite easily with a weather balloon up into low Earth orbit and detonate it. That's all that's needed.